Systemic racism in Canada. So by your own standard, would, say, Mr. O'Toole qualify as a racist?
Well, I want to be very clear about this moment, and I don't think it's important for me to go out and name everyone who's a racist. That would take me pretty much forever, and it wouldn't really get us anywhere.
One of the issues that we need to talk about is the ongoing use of discriminatory street checks that are stopping people based on the color of their skin.
I can only talk from my perspective, with respect to my experience in law enforcement, when it comes to South Asians that are involved in the gang and drug life. And yes, there is a connection between India and Canada when it comes to some of these gangsters and organized crime groups working together. Some of those that choose to immigrate to Canada have a significant amount of criminal history and affiliation back in India. They're involved in that lifestyle over there, where they're involved in drug trafficking, they're involved in that lifestyle, and they end up moving to Canada. Canada simply becomes a safe haven for them, where then they end up conducting their drug business here as well.
And this is something that must end. We passed recently a motion at our national convention talking about the fact that we need to build and work towards a society and a Canada that is free from street checks. People should not be stopped by the police simply because of the color of their skin. That should not happen in our country. I can share a personal story where as a kid growing up, I was stopped multiple times throughout my life, even as a law student. And being stopped in your own community, where you live, where you were born, for no other reason than the way you look, is something that sends a message that people don't belong, that there's something wrong with just being who you are. There's something wrong with your identity. Where we've seen people killed and brutalized by the police. We've seen the RCMP brutalize and kill people, and specifically Indigenous people and racialized people. So in light of that, in light of the movement that says Black Lives Matter, and it does, then why is the Prime Minister simply giving symbolic gestures and saying words instead of doing something concrete? So I call on the Prime Minister. What have the Prime Minister's actions been? In fact, he has done less to address police brutality and violence than even Trump has done. And that is shameful.
How has the community responded?
I'll be very honest with you. I'm very disappointed. I really am. The South Asian community as a whole, they don't work together. I'll say that right out, because as the South Asian community is all about sweeping it underneath the rug, pretending it doesn't exist. It's blind denial. It's the ostrich with the head in the sand approach. And secondly, unlike India, where we grew up in villages, and it goes back to that old saying, it takes a village to raise a child, where we all helped out. Here, everybody minds their own business. So if some kid is involved in drugs or gangs, everybody takes the attitude, it's not our problem, right? It's that families, that parents, their responsibility, their problem, they can deal with it. And the real dawn of gangsterism here, so to speak, was Bindi Johal.
I never worry about my safety. My safety is no problem.
And what about the shootings last night?
Just move the camera, you might have to worry about your safety.
And the DeSange brothers. And so that cycle was in the early 90s. And there was multiple homicides that came as a result of that. And you could say that was truly the beginning of South Asian gang crime in North America.
And that's something we need to stop. We need to make sure that the message is loud and clear, that everyone is celebrated in our society, in our country, and that's why it's such an important thing for us to tackle. We also know that there is disproportionate representation in terms of incarceration because of color of skin.
The independent soldiers have a lot of South Asians. So does the UN gang, so do the Red Scorpions, so do the Brothers Keepers. Many of the gangs have very strong representation from the South Asian community. The ruffians, that they operate out of the Fraser Valley here in British Columbia, and a lot of them are composed of international students that have immigrated to Canada under work visas or under student visas.
In addition to ending street checks, which is one of the first steps we need to take, we also look at the recent justice bill that the government tabled.
In the late 80s, the Golden Temple attack happened in 84. Shortly thereafter, you'll notice there was a massive migration of Southeast Asians coming from India in the late 80s and early 90s. And so they were coming to Canada, they were settling here, they were trying to become financially independent and stable. But while they were busy at work, their children were also adjusting to a Western style of life in school. So reconciling and finding that balance between their culture, their values, their traditions versus Western culture. So there was obviously a lot of challenges that came with that. So what ended up happening is the South Asians would band together in little gangs to protect one another. But unfortunately, that gradually escalated from just insulating and protecting one another as a defensive tactic to becoming more of a threat and intimidation and use of violence as a tool to make money selling drugs. And they realized how lucrative it was. Everything you could possibly imagine. Drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, extortions, robberies, kidnappings, prostitution, you name it. Like, it is unbelievable. But primarily what we're noticing is the South Asians are involved in the drug trafficking business.
And a report in 2020 said that Indo-Canadian crime syndicates were funding secessionist groups to rekindle the movement. The Brothers Keepers gang, one of the biggest Indo-Canadian crime networks, was found funding Sikhs for Justice and those associated with the Khalistan movement.
Well, this was a terrifying gangland hit, of a senior functionary, a senior gangster of a gang called the Brothers Keepers gang. This is one of the most prominent Khalistani Indo-Canadian organized crime groups operating in Canada. That Harpreet Uppal is this 41-year-old gangster who was shot dead in his car in Edmonton, along with his 11-year-old son. The most horrifying part of this case, Gaurav, is that the 11-year-old son was known to be in the vehicle, and the attackers apparently decided to eliminate him as well.
In that bill, this was an opportunity to tackle the Harper era Republican-style mandatory minimums, to repeal them and to end them.
We're arresting people 4, 5, 6 times now on warrants. If that's happening, those people are oftentimes continuing to offend.
Outgoing top cop RCMP Superintendent Sid Leckie speaking out after 4 years at the helm. Leckie says Supreme Court of Canada rulings and changes to Bill C-75 pertaining to bail and time in custody have essentially handcuffed police when dealing with chronic offenders. Mayors from across the province pleading with the government for help. The BC Urban Mayors Caucus released alarming statistics in 10 cities, just 200 plus chronic offenders involved in over 11,600 police incidents in the last year alone. The caucus also released data which revealed a 75% increase of no charge assessments by Crown, guilty judgments down 20%, and a 26% increase in cases stopped or suspended.
The onus is on police and the justice system, the courts, to release people with the least amount of conditions on them as possible. Well, if that's the case, then it becomes a little more challenging to hold some people accountable.
A system of catch and release ineffective, says Leckie.
There's got to be consequences for actions, and right now it doesn't feel like we're getting a lot of that.
We know that mandatory minimums do not work in terms of reducing crime. They don't do that. The evidence makes it very clear. And what happens is mandatory minimums disproportionately impact racialized communities, in particular people from the Black community and Indigenous communities.
Posting videos showing porch pirates stealing your packages might be infringing on the thieves' privacy rights. That's the warning coming from police in Quebec. Uploading surveillance video puts you at risk of breaking laws. Quebec police saying you could potentially get hit with defamation charges by showing their face on your porch.
You cannot post the images yourself because you have to remember that in Canada we have a presumption of innocence. And posting that picture could be a violation of private life.
People often post these clips online to try and get the public's help finding the person. So being told not to is creating some buzz online.
From many of your members saying that gun ownership should be a right, like as a property right. And I've also heard, unfortunately, and I think it is most unfortunate, some of your members suggesting that they need to carry those weapons for personal protection. That's not the law in Canada.
So that we can shift resources away from policing into community resources.
Mr. Speaker, violent crime has risen 32% since the Liberals formed government in 2015. This is a fact across all of Canada and including in my riding, where I'm reading local headlines titled "Arrested Again" for participation in a criminal organization, failure to comply with a probation order, 11 counts of knowledge of a possession of a firearm while prohibited, 2 counts of disobeying a court order, 2 counts of breach of a weapons prohibition. Why are the Liberals removing mandatory minimums on repeat offenders, and when will they repeal their soft on crime policies?
Even after the mass murder in Nova Scotia, the solution was not better mental health or better controls on illegal guns, because the murderer in that case had brought his guns in from the States. It was to go after law-abiding hunters and sport shooters, collectors, and say, you have assault-like rifles. Those are very bad, and we have to take them away from you. That's the attitude of the Trudeau government. But there's another thing in this Statistics Canada report that's very telling. It says that the vast majority of guns used in crimes in Canada were not used by lawful gun owners. They were not legally acquired. And so the conclusion has to be that going after law-abiding gun owners will do nothing to reduce crime. We know that.
The overwhelming, whatever that is, 98% of these firearms are traced from the U.S. So that speaks to the Chief's comment about our border integrity and the flow of illegal crime guns coming up from the United States.
Every year, Statistics Canada comes out with a report on gun violence in Canada. What's always struck me about it, and I've looked at it for the last 25 years, is how few gun-related murders we have in this country. Usually we have under 200. This past year, though, we had over 300. And the rate of violent gun crime in Canada has increased. It went up over 9% from the previous year. That's led by Toronto, where it's up nearly 40%, and Vancouver, where it's up nearly 30%. Now, because those two cities are big liberal strongholds, you can expect the Trudeau government to say, aha, we have to do something to limit gun sales in this country. And they will go after law-abiding gun owners. They do that every time.
This is something that could have been addressed by the government when they introduced their justice bill, but they didn't. And this was a major loss.
All of the measures the Liberals have taken since 1995, when they first brought in their gun registry, have done nothing to reduce gun crime, because they go after the wrong people. They go after law-abiding citizens. Indeed, previous studies of crime in Canada have shown that people who legally own guns, who go through all the hoops of getting a license and registering their guns when it was necessary to register guns, they had a lower crime rate than non-gun owners. They were among the safest people in the country. Yet time after time after time, when the Liberals want to make a big show of getting tough on crime, they go after law-abiding gun owners. But I want to reiterate, the Statistics Canada study that shows gun crime is up in the country also shows that gun crime is not caused by law-abiding gun owners in legal possession of their guns. The other thing that's very important is that same study showed the guns that criminals are using do not come from law-abiding gun owners. They weren't stolen from people who acquired the guns legally. That's always a big thing the Liberals say. Well, they say, we aren't going after law-abiding gun owners because they're committing crime. But, the criminals are stealing guns from them. So we have to have these really severe storage laws, and we'd really rather they don't have the guns in the first place so they can't be stolen. But the StatsCan numbers show they're not being stolen from law-abiding gun owners. They're being acquired illegally. Lots of them, most of them, come in from the United States. They're smuggled in by other criminals. That's what's causing gun crime in Canada. The spike in gun crime is the result of more smuggling of guns into the country and a greater criminal element, because they're not being locked away. They don't have to worry about being let out on bail. They're let out on bail automatically. They get out of their prison sentences earlier. That's what's causing gun crime. And until a Liberal government fesses up to their responsibility for that, nothing's going to get any better. For Post Media, I'm Lorne Gunter.